Welcome to The Explainer. If you look around, we all have that one neighbor or coworker who just seems almost too perfect, right? They never lose their temper, their lawn is immaculate, they're always perfectly composed. But what if the most destructive forces in your life aren't the obvious villains? What if they're actually charming, polite, maybe even your own family members? Today we're shining a light on the unseen psychological forces secretly governing our relationships. We're getting into the mechanics of the human psyche and how the unexamined darkness of others might literally be silently invading your own mind.
Just think about this for a second. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling utterly, inexplicably exhausted? Or suddenly found yourself being blamed for a situation you definitely didn't create? Or maybe treated as the savior for a tragedy that has absolutely nothing to do with you? Well, if you have, I promise you, you aren't crazy. You've just been pulled down into the underworld of someone else's psyche. Basically, you've been used as a vessel for their unhealed trauma.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this chilling warning from the pioneering psychologist Carl Jung is really the key to understanding everything we're about to discuss today. Jung dedicated his life to studying these hidden dynamics, and he realized that most of what governs us is completely outside of our conscious control. When someone is blind to their own internal darkness, that darkness doesn't just, sit quietly. No, it actively seeks a host. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, that host is you.
Jung actually called this dangerous dynamic projection. And what it is, it's an unconscious mechanism where another person projects onto you the exact traits, fears, and flaws they absolutely refuse to see in themselves. And the moment this happens, you kind of cease to be a real, multidimensional person to them. You become a mere symbol, a mirror, an imaginary enemy, or even an idealized hero. You're basically dragged onto a psychological battlefield that isn't yours, fighting ghosts that belong entirely to someone else.
So this brings us directly to our first major focus, the owner of the repressed shadow. Now, these individuals don't look dangerous at first glance. Actually, they often look perfect. But deep within the basement of the soul, where they lock away literally everything they consider ugly or unacceptable, an incredibly toxic darkness is fermenting.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer contrast. On the outside, the owner of the repressed shadow is controlled, moderate, and disciplined. They're the person who is always perfectly polite. But underneath all that, the inner reality is a brewing storm. Because they push down every negative emotion, they're secretly fermenting hatred, rationalizing envy, and building up this explosive resentment. They're trying to be light all the time, right up until the darkness inevitably takes control.
Jung wrote in his work Aeon that the shadow is exactly this. It's everything the individual refuses to recognize in themselves. And we have to be super clear here. The shadow is strictly internal. It's not the evil of the outside world. It's the hatred they won't admit they feel. It's the desires they push down. They don't overcome these feelings, they just merely repress them, pushing them deeper and deeper into the unconscious until they eventually lose their grip.
And when that grip finally slips, the results are absolutely devastating. Because they live in constant emotional vigilance, they just don't allow themselves to feel, so they ruthlessly condemn those who do. Suddenly you see these massive, totally disproportionate emotional reactions, devastating explosions over the smallest, most insignificant things. They hold grudges for years. They sabotage relationships in a deeply passive-aggressive way. They essentially become the difficult people that no one really understands.
But here is the ultimate tragedy of the shadow. It doesn't just contain bad things. It also holds their denied potential, their repressed creativity, their hidden strength. But when the shadow is entirely ignored, even those beautiful things rot. It's like everything turns into a toxic poison, and that poison contaminates their environment, their relationships, and especially the people standing closest to them.
All right, so this brings us to a second highly dangerous profile, the moral controller, the guardian of virtue hiding inner demons. And this brilliantly illustrates how intense repression is often fed by an illusion of superiority. They don't just repress their own desires, they actually actively make you feel guilty for living yours. They use a rigid moral ideal as a dangerous false light to enforce psychic repression. On the one hand, we see their disguise, right? Ethics, righteousness, and supposedly good intentions. They claim to be driven by pure morality. But on the flip side, we see the hidden trap. They literally weaponize that morality, transforming it into a cage of guilt, shame, and projection. It is psychological control perfectly disguised as virtue.
So a moral controller is someone who desperately needs to maintain an image of moral superiority. According to Jung, the greater a person's internal repression, the more intense their need to project their shadow onto others. So what do? They transform the people around them into sinners, deviants, or immoral figures. And they do this to completely avoid facing their own impulses and their own messy internal contradictions.
Imagine being trapped on the receiving end of these phrases. It's for your own good. Someone needs to tell you the truth. The moral controller genuinely believes they're correcting or educating you. And that's what makes their influence so incredibly toxic. It's cloaked in authority. But that so-called truth they're hitting you with, it isn't neutral at all. It is completely laden with their own pure projection.
So the crucial point is this. When they're pointing fingers and judging, the unconscious motive is just maintaining their own illusion of moral purity. When they're educating you, it actually stems from a paralyzing fear of their own shadow. The extreme moralist does not actually want truth. What they want is absolute control. And when they can't control the external world, they demand rigid obedience to desperately control your internal world.
If you live with a moral controller, you know this feeling. Even when you're just living your life, minding your own business, you feel watched, judged, and diminished. And the most perverse part is that you actually begin to internalize their judgment. You start to repress parts of yourself that are totally natural, spontaneous, and human, all just to survive their constant scrutiny. The morality of the other person literally becomes your prison.
But listen, you do not have to stay in this psychological hostage position. Recognizing these dynamics is the absolute first step toward reclaiming your psychic freedom. It's time to make the ascent from the underworld. It's time to hand the power back to where it belongs, with you.
Let's move to and see how this builds into real actionable protection. To break these invisible threads, you must first recognize the projection patterns when they happen. Second, actively cut those invisible emotional threads connecting you to their narrative. Third, and this is absolutely crucial, constantly ask yourself, is what I'm feeling right now actually mine, or has it been induced by them? By doing this, you reclaim absolute sovereignty over your own psyche.
It's not just about protecting yourself from others, though. Jung reminds us that none of us are immune. We all have a shadow, we all have pain. The true difference lies in who has the courage to look within. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a haunting question to reflect on. Which of these shadows is currently hiding in your own basement? Until next time, keep exploring.